Welcome. Tonight's story is about silence and a boy who vanished into the world he dreamed. It begins not with a cry, but with quiet. He was crowned a king, but lived like a ghost, building empty castles, whispering to mirrors, and vanishing into a silent lake. They called him mad, but maybe he was only dreaming with his eyes open. This is history. He came into the world without a sound. The nurses waited for the newborn prince to cry, to scream, to announce himself to the golden halls into which he'd been born. But there was nothing, no tears, no gasping breaths, just a strange, unblinking calm. His wide blue eyes scanned the candlelit chamber with a slow, unnerving focus, as if he already knew the world he had entered, as if he had seen it before. They named him Ludwig, the name of emperors, of conquerors, of men who had carved their will into stone and soil. But from the very beginning, this Ludwig seemed cut from another fabric altogether. He did not fuss or shout like other boys. He did not run through corridors or slam his fists in rage. He wandered quietly through the cold marble halls of the palace, brushing his small fingers along the gilded walls as though listening to them. The world around him, so loud, so full of expectation, did not reach him. As he grew, so did the gap between himself and everyone else. His tutors praised his intelligence, but found his silence troubling. He was prone to long, quiet pauses, even when spoken to directly. He did not dislike company, but he rarely sought it. He preferred swans to people, silence to conversation, and fairy tales to facts. He read for hours at a time, sitting cross-legged in the sunlit corners of the royal library, sketching towers with impossible spires and castles that seemed to float in clouds. He often spoke of voices he heard in the wind, of dreams he could remember even while awake. His father, King Maximilian II, saw none of this as useful. The king was a man of order, of statecraft, of military logic. He believed in precision and obedience, in raising his son to rule with discipline. But Ludwig shrank from such things. He struggled through lessons in diplomacy and law. He was overwhelmed by formal dinners and state rituals. His mother, Queen Marie, was a more distant figure, devout and elegant, but emotionally unreachable. Ludwig, the sensitive child, seemed stranded between duty and desire, between the world of politics and the world of dreams. At night, he would stand at his window in silence, his breath fogging the glass as he watched the stars. He often spoke to them, not in words but in glances, in stillness. Servants sometimes heard him humming softly to himself, music that no one had taught him, music that sounded half like a lullaby, half like a prayer. He was not lonely in the way people understood. He was simply alone in a way no one else could feel. By the time he was 12, it was clear that Ludwig was not like the other royals, and the court began to murmur. They called him strange, melancholic, eccentric, but they didn't understand what they were looking at. He wasn't a failed prince. He was something else entirely. A boy born into the wrong world, dreaming of another. Ludwig was just 18 when they placed the crown on his head, and in that moment, all the poetry of his childhood evaporated beneath the weight of velvet robes and golden expectations. The coronation was a spectacle, majestic, solemn, watched by thousands and choreographed down to every last trumpet note. But amid the incense and the Latin prayers and the glinting swords held high, Ludwig stood rigid and far away, like a figure carved from snow. He said the words. He smiled when they asked him to. But his soul had already begun to drift. To the world, Bavaria had gained a king, but Ludwig felt as though something had been quietly taken from him. His crown was not a symbol of power, but of confinement. He had not dreamed of ruling. He had dreamed of wandering forests, of building castles in the mist, of composing letters to the moon. But now the doors had shut behind him. The walls had risen, and the crown, though gleaming and ancient, felt more like a cage than a gift. In the early days of his reign, he tried. He attended court sessions. He reviewed regiments, signed decrees, nodded at ambassadors with practiced courtesy. But his heart was not in it. The language of politics was cold and brittle. Every conversation felt like a performance. Every decision like a sacrifice of something precious inside him. He grew restless in meetings, fidgeted during ceremonies, and wandered off after official dinners without saying goodbye. It wasn't defiance. It was weariness. The weight of pretense became heavier than the crown itself. His ministers noticed, of course. They whispered behind closed doors, wringing their hands over the young king's absences. His lack of attention to state affairs, his growing obsession with art, music, and, above all, solitude. He stopped dining with others. He read for days at a time, disappearing into volumes of German romantic poetry, the operas of Richard Wagner, and tales of mythical kings who ruled not through war, but through wonder. He became reclusive, not with bitterness, but with longing, for a life that felt gentler than the one his ancestors had carved in stone. It wasn't that he couldn't lead, it was that the kingdom he longed to lead did not exist. Not in this world, not in this time. And so he began to retreat, first in spirit, then in presence. He spent less time in Munich, more time at Hohenschwangau, his childhood home nestled in the mountains. He withdrew from public view, letting his ministers handle the practical work of governance while he walked for hours along forest paths, spoke softly to the wind, and imagined places that had never been built. But the silence he chose came with consequences. The court began to speak of madness, not loudly, not officially, but persistently. They could not understand a king who did not hunger for power. They did not trust a ruler who preferred starlight to speeches. And the more Ludwig turned inward, the more the world around him sharpened its gaze. He did not yet know it, but every step he took away from the throne was being recorded, measured, and filed away. Bavaria had crowned a dreamer, and dreamers, they believed, did not belong on thrones. Still, Ludwig did not turn back. He would not become what they wanted him to be. If he could not rule the world he was given, then he would begin to build the one he needed. It began with a sketch, nothing more than a few pencil lines drawn in the margins of a worn notebook. Delicate towers piercing the clouds, bridges that vanished into sky, and windows shaped like tears. Ludwig would sit by the window for hours, drawing and redrawing the same scene, over and over, refining his vision of something too perfect for the world he lived in. These were not castles for kings and courts. These were not palaces of state or war. These were sanctuaries, as places that could hold beauty without agenda, silence without suspicion. He chose the site himself, a rocky hilltop near his childhood home, where fog rolled in like whispered memory, and swans drifted across the nearby lake as if moved by unseen hands. That place would become Neuschwanstein, New Swan Stone, a name that sounded like the sigh of a forgotten fairy tale. It would be his masterpiece, his refuge, his rebellion against the world that misunderstood him. And from the moment the first stone was laid, it was clear. This was not a building. This was a dream being made solid. But it wasn't just Neuschwanstein. One castle was not enough to hold all the weight of what he carried inside. Next came Linderhof, nestled deep in the forest like a jewel box left open beneath the trees. Smaller, more private. A temple of mirrors, fountains, velvet, and quiet. Then Herrenchiemsee, an homage to the grandeur of Versailles, built on an island, its vast mirrored halls echoing with a silence far more powerful than applause. He spared no expense. The ceilings were painted with celestial scenes, the walls lined with silk, gold leaf, crystal chandeliers. He filled entire rooms with operatic murals, golden swans, secret passageways, and symbols borrowed from mythology. But these spaces were not designed to host ministers or guests. They were designed for one man and one man alone. These castles were not meant to be lived in. They were meant to be escaped into. At Neuschwanstein, he built halls so vast they swallowed footsteps. He placed his bed beneath a hand-carved canopy of Gothic arches, as if even in sleep he needed shelter from the noise of the world. In Linderhof, he dined alone at a magic table that disappeared beneath the floor, only to return moments later already set with steaming food. No servants, no eyes watching. And in the artificial blue grotto beneath the palace, he would sit in a golden swan boat, surrounded by soft lights and the echo of Wagner's operas, letting music wrap around him like water. To the public, it was madness. To Ludwig, it was the only place where he could breathe. The ministers began to worry, not just about his spending, but about his mind. Why did he build palaces where no one stayed? Why did he avoid court, avoid company, avoid the very duties of kingship. They did not understand that for Ludwig, the architecture was not decoration, it was survival. Every tower he raised, every hallway he gilded, was a step further from the noise and cruelty of a world that had never felt like his. He was not running from reality, he was creating one. And for a while, as long as the stones kept rising and the windows caught the light just right, he believed he could live there, inside the world of his own making, a world made of quiet, of music, of peace. But dreams that grow too large cannot be hidden forever. And far below the mountain peaks, the people of Bavaria were beginning to ask, where was their king? And what exactly was he building so far from them, in the mist? As the towers of Neuschwanstein climbed higher into the sky, Ludwig seemed to vanish deeper into their shadow. He no longer belonged to Munich, nor to the palace where ministers waited with sealed envelopes and anxious glances. He no longer belonged to court, or to policy, or even to the people who called him king. He belonged only to the world he had created, a world of hushed corridors, mirrored halls, and voices that came from orchestras rather than governments. He stopped attending meetings altogether. Reports were delivered to closed doors and left unread. When his ministers begged for his attention, he answered with silence. If pressed, he replied in letters written by candlelight, ornate, poetic, and evasive. They asked for signatures, he responded with metaphors. They asked for budgets, he replied with verses from Wagner. He stopped dining in company. His meals were prepared and delivered without servants in the room. In one castle, he had a table designed that could lower through the floor, vanish into the kitchen below, and rise again already set, so he could eat without being watched. To some, this was extravagance, but to Ludwig, it was protection, a shield from the eyes of a world that never saw him clearly. He rode through the mountains at dusk, cloaked in furs, disappearing into valleys with only a few trusted servants following at a distance. He would stop at a frozen stream and stare into it for an hour. He would pause beneath pine trees and whisper to the wind, as if it might answer. And all the while, the court below grew nervous. Bavaria had a king who did not rule, who did not speak, who lived in palaces no one else could enter. The rumors sharpened like blades. They whispered that he had gone mad, that he had conjured imaginary companions, that he believed himself to be a figure from legend, a new Parsifal, a lonely hero from an opera with no audience. But madness was not the word. Not really. He was not irrational. He was not dangerous. He was simply unwilling. Unwilling to give up what little light he had found in a life that had always felt too loud, too cold, too sharp. They mistook his sorrow for insanity. They mistook his stillness for delusion. But Ludwig had not forgotten who he was. He had simply remembered something the rest of them had lost: the aching need for beauty, for silence, for a world without violence and greed. He no longer saw himself as a ruler of men. He saw himself as a steward of imagination, a guardian of forgotten magic. A king, yes, but not of Bavaria, of something older, something gentler, something sacred. And because they could not follow him there, into his towers, into his quiet, into his dreams, they decided to drag him back, or to bring him down. The ministers did not act out of haste. They waited. They watched. For years they had tolerated the king's absence, his indulgences, his refusal to play the part the crown demanded. But the patience of politics has limits, and theirs had been stretched too far. The treasuries were thinning, the people were restless. And while Ludwig decorated grottos with golden swans and commissioned new chandeliers for ballrooms no one danced in, the court below murmured with growing urgency. They had asked him for answers. He gave them poetry. They asked for order. He gave them music. They wanted a king. He gave them dreams. So they turned to something colder. They summoned physicians, not to heal but to judge. 4 doctors signed the decree. Ludwig was declared insane, unfit to rule, incapable of governing. None of them had spoken to him. None had visited his castles. None had looked him in the eyes. But their words were enough. Enough to break centuries of royal tradition, enough to tear a crown from a king's head, without a confrontation, without a trial, without a voice raised in his defense. It was early summer in 1886 when they came for him. The sky was pale. The lake near his castle shimmered softly, still unaware of what it would soon witness. The officials arrived quietly at Neuschwanstein. They brought papers, guards, and the weight of a decision already made. Ludwig met them in his chambers, where he had been writing by lamplight. They say he did not panic, he did not shout, he did not resist. He folded the paper in front of him, looked at the men who had come to take his life apart, and nodded once. He went with them willingly, as if he had known this moment was always coming. They moved him to Berg Castle, a villa beside Lake Starnberg. It was beautiful, peaceful, silent, a prison made of flowers and glass. He was no longer a king, not in the eyes of the state, but in Ludwig's mind, he was still building towers. He was still walking down halls no one else could see. He was watched constantly. Guards outside his doors, attendants measuring his movements. The world that had once feared his absence now studied his presence, trying to understand the man they had labeled mad. But Ludwig gave them nothing. Not rage, not compliance, just quiet. A deeper, heavier quiet than they had ever known. On June 13th, just days after his removal, he asked to take a walk along the lake. The evening was still, the air warm. A doctor accompanied him, one of the very men who had signed the order to take away his crown. They walked toward the water and into the trees, and then they did not return. Evening came slowly over Lake Starnberg, like a sigh spreading across the water. The sky turned soft and gray, the light dimming to a pewter hush. A few birds called out across the trees, but even their voices seemed to fade as Ludwig stepped onto the path beside the lake, his footsteps muffled by damp earth and the low murmur of waves brushing the shore. The doctor walked beside him, Dr. Gudden, a man Ludwig had once trusted, a man who had signed away his crown. No guards followed, no one intervened. It was meant to be a quiet walk, fresh air, a moment of peace for the exiled king. At least that was the story told afterward. They passed beneath tall trees. The lake glittered between the branches, and then they vanished. Hours passed. The sun set. Darkness spread across the grounds like ink. Servants waited at the villa. No one returned. At last, a search party was sent down the path. Torches flickered along the shoreline. Boots crunched through wet grass. And there, just a few feet from the water's edge, they found them. First the doctor, face down in the shallows, his body cold, his clothes soaked, no bruises, no blood, just silence. Then Ludwig, floating nearby, on his back, as if asleep beneath the surface. His arms were crossed over his chest, his eyes were closed. There were no signs of a struggle, no wounds, no noise, just the stillness of water that had swallowed too much and refused to say why. The official report said drowning, but the questions began almost immediately. The lake was shallow where they were found, no deeper than waist height. Ludwig was a strong swimmer. There were no indications of panic, no broken branches or dragged footprints. Nothing had been heard, no calls for help, no thrashing, only the fading light of evening, and then nothing at all. Whispers rose. Had it been suicide? Was there a scuffle? Had someone followed them? Had the doctor tried to escape or attack? Or had Ludwig done the unthinkable? Or had they simply walked into the water, both men in quiet agreement, and vanished from history together? No one knew. No one ever would. Ludwig was 39 years old. His life had ended not in a palace, not in battle, not in madness, but in stillness, in silence, in water that refused to tell the truth. They buried him in royal silence, beneath the great cathedral in Munich, beside kings who had waged wars, signed treaties, and fathered dynasties. Ludwig had done none of those things. He left behind no heirs, no legacy of conquest, no victory carved into marble. His crown was removed, his title stripped, and yet of all the kings buried beneath that floor, his name is the one people remember, because what Ludwig left behind could not be buried. His castles still rise from the mountains, like dreams no one managed to wake from. Neuschwanstein, his masterpiece, still pierces the Bavarian sky. its white towers glowing like bone against the trees. From afar, it looks impossible. Up close, it feels like something holy. Visitors come by the thousands each day. They walk its halls, camera in hand, unaware they are trespassing through the pages of a fairy tale written in grief. There are no thrones inside, no councils, no royal echoes, only murals of swans and gods and lost kings, only staircases that spiral up and end in quiet. Linderhof still stands in the forest, its gardens too perfect for accident. Its mirrored rooms reflect nothing but light and longing. The man who built it walked those halls alone. Now strangers admire the ceilings he never finished, and the furniture no one used. And Herrenchiemsee, his island palace, a tribute to Versailles, rests in a fog that never quite lifts. A palace built for ceremony, where no ceremony was ever held. A stage without actors, a monument to the king who filled it with silence instead of speeches. Every wall Ludwig touched still holds his fingerprints. Every window he shaped still catches the same afternoon light. But it is not just the stone that remembers him. There are those who say his spirit remains, not haunting, but watching, not restless, but present. There are moments, usually in winter, usually when the fog is thick, when a visitor will pause and feel something shift, as if they are no longer alone in the room, as if someone, somewhere, is still listening. And perhaps he is. Perhaps Ludwig never truly left. Perhaps in the quiet he loved most, in the spaces he carved for ghosts, he found a place to stay. Not a palace, not a throne, just a single sacred silence, the kind that only dreamers can enter. And if one night you find yourself standing beneath the towers of Neuschwanstein, and the wind moves through the trees like a hymn, and the mist clings to your shoulders like memory, listen closely. You might hear footsteps, or humming, or nothing at all, and you'll know. He is still there, not as a madman, not as a king, but as the quiet boy who built beauty because the world could not.